It must say something about how good Martin Scorsese's Italian Mafia movies are when this director of over 25 feature-length films is often only remembered by some as a director of mob flicks. In reality, he has made only 3, with one more along the way, The Irishman. And even then, the protagonist in that film is not going to be Italian. I wanted to have a look at the upcoming picture and see how it could relate to Scorsese's crime resume and what, if anything, it could add to a group of movies that have already said so much. In 1973, up-and-coming director Scorsese cemented himself as someone to watch with the visceral and fierce crime film Mean Streets, about a duo of hoodlums growing up in Little Italy, where Scorsese himself lived in during his youth. What we saw on screen had an improvisational feel to it, like all the mundane conversations, date nights and bar fights were really happening, and we just happened to be there. But the chaos was being puppeteered by a future master, suggested by the way this film was shot and edited. Rock and roll, long takes, ultra-violence and whip pans were just some of the few elements, in addition to themes of machoism and Catholic guilt, that would go on to be staple Scorsese trademarks. The film dealt with degenerates and scumbags, and yet they were human. In some cases they were even charismatic, their lifestyle inviting. But ultimately Scorsese would pull the plug on this romantic fantasy that was the mob way of life and unleash chaos in the final third of the movie. The film had a dirty feel, gritty and rough around the edges. It had a feeling of something trying to burst out and move away from the piss-stained and littered sidewalks, trying to be something different and to stand out, much like the main character and the man behind the camera. Scorsese had poured personal dilemmas and his own internal conflicts into the movie, and it has been suggested that we could see the main character as Scorsese himself in his earlier days. Something interesting to note was the movie's lack of plot. If you had to explain what happens in the movie in a couple of sentences, what would you say? It's difficult. Scorsese has said that he does not pay a great deal of attention to plot. In fact, he claims The Departed, made in 2006, is the first movie he ever made with a plot. Rather, his attention is fixated on character, and Mean Streets, despite being directed by a no-name starring no-names on a shoestring budget, has great characters. Characters that feel real. Characters who don't move or act for the sake of the plot or sequences of events, but rather their emotions and interactions are the centerpiece of the film, a core element without which Mean Streets doesn't exist. With this movie, it isn't such and such happens, and then such and such happens, and because such and such happened, such and such happens. Cause and effect is thrown out the window, replaced with an emphasis on what is said, what isn't said, what is meant, what is this character feeling, how is this character changing, if you put these two characters in a room together and lock the door, what will happen, etc, etc. When the characters are as strong as they are in Mean Streets, who needs a plot? Let the characters take it away. The style in which Scorsese directed Mean Streets, the beautiful marriage of music and images, coarse and jagged though admirable, was perfected by the time he revisited that world with the incredible Goodfellas. Again, the mob life feels entrancing and inviting, and again it is shown to be ruthless and ultimately not rewarding. A generation who had grown up on gangster films showcasing mobsters as operatic and tragic figures, almost samurai-like, were given a slap to the face and a gun to the head with the captivating but punishing 1990 picture. Nowhere is the essence of this best summarized than when Henry Hill's chuff narration explains as to why Gangster Tommy DeVito being made was such a great thing. The movie lures you in with a combination of great acting, a blissful soundtrack, and a genuine sense of happiness for these crooks. No matter what they are and the things they've done, in this moment in time we feel their joy, and then, bang! There's your gangster life. See yourself out. Despite the obvious dangerous nature of the mob world, we can't help but feel seduced at the lifestyle, reconstructed so brilliantly by Scorsese. When Henry Hill peers down from his window at these mobsters, as an asthma-stricken and bedroom-confined Scorsese must have once done atop the streets of Little Italy, we are right there with him, hopping along with him on this doomed fairy tale. Henry represents us, the ever-outsider, looking in on this world but never really fitting in. He's unable, given his bloodline, but disregarding that, Henry is closer to us than we are to any of the rest of the characters. He shares our bemusement when Tommy, after beating a man almost to death, is worried that he spilled blood on the floor of the club owned by Henry, or when the crew of gangsters show more concern about digging a hole to throw a murdered bartender in, as opposed to actually murdering him in the first place. Goodfellas is easier to be immersed into than Mean Streets, not just because of the improvement of the craft, but because of this character of Henry, who acts as our window into this world where bloodshed is an everyday occurrence. And like Mean Streets, though things seem not to be so bad on the whole, the veil is lifted towards the end of the film. Paranoid, tense and anxious are just few of the ways to describe Henry in the last half an hour of the film, and the kinetic and coked up style that the film goes in, accelerating to his inevitable downfall and the ironic ending. Now the fairy tale is over, he can't stop thinking about the life, ignorant to the fact that he should be happy to be alive, not spend his time complaining about egg noodle and ketchup. The wise guys in this film are a different caliber to Mean Streets, a step up. Where those guys were merely hoodlums, street thugs with dead-end prospects, the characters in Goodfellas are a step up. They are the money earners, the guys sticking their head out of the water trying to avoid jail time, a bullet to the head, in the hope of being made and officially recognized as part of a crime syndicate. But what about those who actually are in a crime syndicate then? Enter Casino. These guys were certified mafioso, the bosses, pretty much as high as you could go, the very people who would be in charge of the level of mobsters in Goodfellas. The income is better, the power more influential, the stakes higher, but the mistakes made by those in the film are just as prevalent as the low-level thugs of the previous films, and in the end it topples an entire empire. The technique and style that was used for Casino was very similar to Scorsese's 1990 Oscar-nominated film, which drew criticism from critics at the time, claiming the film was basically Goodfellas in Las Vegas. With that in mind, I think the film was quite symbolic in the sense that some of his favourite themes, mainly greed, are elevated and brought to the forefront. Henry is touching the waters in Goodfellas, sometimes just trying to stay alive, keep his state constant. But here the primary characters, much like Scorsese himself, are indulging in their wants to the fullest. Scorsese was at the height of his power here, and it's fitting that he makes a movie about the mob at their highest peak too. If the question in Goodfellas is, why would someone want to join the mob and how does one do so, then the question is Casino is what happens once you've made it, and how on earth do you mess something like that up? Scorsese said about Casino that it is essentially having no plot, it's all about character, another link to the previous two movies. Though Goodfellas is almost unanimously touted as the better film, Casino is not to be dismissed. In fact, it touches on things that its predecessor does not. As stated, the theme of greed is front and center, and even arguably the greed of the filmmakers and the studio for entering this world again after only 5 years. There's something about the film that screams excess, indulgence, and in relation to the development of the characters' lives, the false hope, the dangling bait that is the American dream. Yes, I always felt that Casino had a tragic element to it. It's difficult to put the finger on what exactly gets me to feel this way. Perhaps it's simply the church choir the movie's opening titles are accompanied with. Perhaps it's seeing these characters waste away such an amazing gift in life as effortlessly as they received it in the first place. Or perhaps it's just the fact that the mob life, on screen at least, always seems to be accompanied by a sense of tragedy full stop. Crime and cinema have always been fascinatingly linked, going back to what was one of the first narrative films ever made with the Great Train Robbery, which is homaged at the end of Goodfellas. What is it about these characters, this way of living, that is so inviting, attractive and appealing? I'm in no way educated enough to properly articulate just what appeals to me about these kind of films, but perhaps it is this screen, this camera, this barrier which separates us from the violence and death, giving us peace of mind and allowing us to be entertained, to enter a world of crime without consequence for ourselves. A bit like how going on a roller coaster ride is like, say, experiencing the thrill of a car crash without the danger, or watching a horror movie, a serial killer movie, with the jump scares and such, for the excitement, without the fear of death that would accompany actually being stalked. Either way, what is ultimately tragic, for me at least, is that Casino was the last of the great American crime movies. Yes, there were some good ones that came after, like Donnie Brasco or American Gangster, but nothing quite touched the level of Casino. Scorsese never even made a film as good as. De Niro, Pesci never made a film as good as. The genre came to an abrupt close, with most modern crime films like Gangster Squad coming and going without any real significance. With mainstream movies adjusting to become politically correct, it doesn't seem the gangster genre is even welcome on the big screen anymore. This is why The Irishman is so important to me. It's another film, despite the cast and director, that never really got to the big screen, instead being produced by the streaming service Netflix. But this film, for me, will act as the curtain closer, the swan song of a genre that didn't really get one before it died. It becomes even more perfect that the golden generation of De Niro, Pesci and Keitel will return, and Al Pacino and Martin will work together for the first time. The old guard will all slip back into mafioso roles, whilst newcomer Pacino will instead play the outsider Jimmy Hoffa, a fitting placement given his detachment to Scorsese compared to the rest of the cast. It's a movie that will hopefully be the most mature and thought-provoking of the 4 films, focusing on the days after the heyday. What happened to Charlie after the attack on him and his friend Johnny Boy at the end of Mean Streets? What happened after Henry closed the door of his cheap home off a construction site in the middle of nowhere at the end of Goodfellas? Those periods in the men's lives were never explored, but here with the life of Frank Sheeran we will take a trip down memory lane with him through the highs and the lows. But after the business successes and the flourishing mob connections, eventually everyone he would come to know, such as Russell Bufalino and Angelo Bruno, would die, and we'd be left with a frail old man looking back on his life, a life in which he is supposed to have murdered over 24 people. This surely will be where the heart of Scorsese's film will be. Sheeran's real-life confession was prompted by a wish for atonement for his sins, which harks back to our protagonist Charlie in Mean Streets and his juggling of his religious dilemma and his criminal lifestyle. We had the low-life thugs, we had the middle-of-the-park hoods, we had the bosses of bosses, and now we have the film centered on aging, elderly gangsters past their primes looking back at the glory days of their zeniths. It's only fitting then that a selection of actors and a director known for these kind of movies will portray these characters, all of whom are also past their prime. And thus, Scorsese's gangster resume comes full circle.